White cops frame black woman unaware she's a CIA agent. The truth explodes in court. What happens next will make you rethink justice and fortitude. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment about where you're watching from. Late at night, Arlington, Virginia. The streets lay quiet. The hum of streetlights flickered above deserted sidewalks. An occasional car sped past, its headlights slicing through the darkness. Talia Porter sat behind the wheel of her sleek black SUV. Hands steady, eyes sharp, she navigated the suburban neighborhood with practiced ease. The day had been long, but productive. Her undercover work in this town was nearly complete. She had all the evidence she needed. By morning, she would be gone. She glanced at her watch, just past midnight. As she neared an empty intersection, the faint glint of a reflective stop sign caught her eye. She eased the SUV to a complete stop, instincts razor-sharp. With a smooth motion, she turned left onto the next street, her mind already mapping out her exit strategy. Then, flashing lights. Red and blue burst across her rearview mirror, slicing through the darkness. A siren wailed. The stillness of the night shattered. Talia didn't panic. She was trained for this. Her breathing steadied, her mind sharpened. Quickly assessing the situation, she guided her car smoothly to the side of the road. With practiced calm, she turned off the engine and reached for the glove compartment, retrieving her license and registration before the officers even approached. The patrol car pulled up behind her. Headlights cast long shadows across her dashboard. Through the mirror, she watched. 2 officers stepped out, their movements deliberate. The driver, a tall man with a square jaw and an authoritative stride, led the way. His partner, shorter and stockier, followed closely behind. Their navy blue Arlington Police Department uniforms were crisp. Badges gleamed under the streetlights. Talia took note of their names as they approached. Officer Brandon Carter. Officer Mark Sullivan. "Good evening, ma'am." Carter's voice carried the forced politeness of authority. He leaned down slightly, his flashlight sweeping across her face, then the interior of her SUV. "You know why I pulled you over tonight?" Talia kept her expression neutral, her dark eyes meeting his without hesitation. "No, officer," she replied evenly. "I wasn't speeding, and I came to a full stop at the intersection." Carter's lips twitched, a smirk. "Actually, you failed to stop at that sign back there," he said, his voice laced with condescension. "That's a moving violation." Talia's brow furrowed slightly, but she kept her composure. "I'm certain I stopped, officer," she said, her tone measured but firm. "Perhaps you're mistaken." Carter's expression hardened. "License and registration," he snapped. Without hesitation, Talia handed him the documents. Slow. Deliberate. She wasn't in the mood for unnecessary escalation, but she could already sense where this was headed. Carter examined her license, his eyes lingering on the details. Virginia plates, local address. Something unreadable flickered across his face. "You live around here?" His voice was casual but probing. Talia nodded. "Yes, officer." Before Carter could respond, Sullivan, who had been lingering near the rear of the SUV, suddenly called out, "Taker, Carter, you might want to take a look back here." Carter straightened, handing Talia's documents back without further comment. "Stay in the car," he ordered, his tone clipped. Then he turned and walked toward the trunk. Talia's jaw tightened as she watched them through her side mirror. Sullivan was pointing at something inside the trunk, his voice low, conspiratorial. Carter nodded, his expression unreadable. The 2 officers exchanged a glance. A flicker of unease passed through her. It wasn't fear. Talia rarely felt fear. But she knew a setup when she saw one. A slow, calculated breath steadied her. If they thought they had an easy target, they were about to realize their mistake. Seconds later, Carter returned to her window. The fake professionalism was gone. His expression was grim. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," he ordered. Talia tilted her head slightly, her voice calm, questioning. "May I ask why, officer?" Carter's jaw tightened. We have reason to believe you're in possession of illegal substances." Talia's eyes narrowed slightly, but her posture remained relaxed. "Illegal substances?" she repeated, her voice cool. "I think you've made a mistake." "We'll see about that," Carter replied, his smirk returning. He gestured for her to exit the vehicle. Sullivan was already waiting at the back of the SUV, arms crossed, a smug expression plastered across his face. Talia let out a slow breath and stepped out, unhurried, deliberate, as though she had all the time in the world. She stood with her hands at her sides, watching as Sullivan theatrically lifted the trunk. He gestured toward a small, unmarked bag sitting conspicuously near the edge. "Well, well," Sullivan's tone was mocking. "What do you know? A bag of powdery goodness?" Talia's gaze flicked to the bag, then back to the officers. Her expression remained unreadable. Inside, her mind worked rapidly, cataloging every detail. That bag hadn't been there when she left her house. She was sure of it. This was a setup. Carter stepped closer, his smirk widening. "Anything you want to tell us, ma'am?" Talia's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, a subtle, calculated expression that conveyed neither fear nor guilt. "I'll save my comments for the appropriate setting," she said. Carter chuckled. He clearly took her calm for arrogance. "Oh, you'll have your chance," he said. "You're under arrest for possession with intent to distribute." Sullivan moved to cuff her. Talia didn't resist. She allowed it, her gaze steady, unflinching. "You're making a big mistake," she said softly. Her voice carried a quiet intensity that made Sullivan pause, just for half a second, before snapping the cuffs into place. "We'll see," Carter said, leading her toward the squad car. "Let's see how confident you are in front of a judge." As they drove away, Talia gazed out the window. Her mind was already spinning through her options. The two officers thought they had just scored an easy arrest. What they didn't know was that they had just walked into the biggest mistake of their lives. Sullivan was enjoying the moment, rolling the small, unmarked bag between his fingers before tossing it onto the evidence counter with an exaggerated flick of his wrist. "Caught her red hand," he sneered. "Looks like she's been running more than stop signs." The other officers in the station barely glanced up. It was late. Most were too busy nursing stale coffee or finishing up reports to care about another so-called drug bust. Talia, however, took everything in. The flickering fluorescent lights, the scuffed linoleum floor, the wary glances from a few younger officers. This was routine to them. How many others had been dragged in like this, victims of manufactured evidence, but they had no idea who she was. Carter grabbed her by the arm, guiding her roughly toward the fingerprinting station. "Let's get this show on the road," he muttered, relishing the moment. As he pressed her fingers against the ink pad, Talia remained silent. Her movements were calculated, precise. She wasn't resisting. She wasn't fighting. She was waiting, watching. The officer working the station, a younger man with tired eyes, hesitated as he glanced at her. Something about her felt off, not in a criminal way, quite the opposite. She wasn't acting like someone who had just been framed. No protests, no pleading, not even a flicker of nervousness. Just silence. "Name?" he asked. "Talia Porter," she replied evenly. "Occupation?" A brief pause, then, "Consultant." The younger officer frowned slightly. The response was vague, almost clinical, but it wasn't a lie. He typed the information into the system, casting another glance at her before continuing the process. Meanwhile, Carter and Sullivan leaned against the counter, whispering to each other. Their laughter was low, smug. Talia finally spoke, her voice slicing through their amusement like a blade. "You seem awfully confident for two men who just made the biggest mistake of their careers." Sullivan's smirk faltered. Carter's eyes narrowed. "You've got a smart mouth," Carter muttered. Let's see how funny you are after a night in lockup." Talia tilted her head slightly. "I don't need to be funny," she said, her voice calm, deliberate. "I just need to be patient." Carter exhaled sharply through his nose, annoyed, but he waved it off. "Book her," he ordered, before turning on his heel and heading toward the break room. Sullivan followed, their laughter picking up once again as they disappeared down the hallway. Talia allowed herself a slow exhale. Her patience was key. Every move they made, every word they spoke, it was all being recorded. The system might have been rigged in their favor, but they had underestimated her. They weren't in control of this situation. Not even close. The cell they placed her in was cold, the metal bench bolted to the wall offering little comfort. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. The bars clanked shut behind her. Carter lingered for a second too long, watching her. "You don't look like the type to get mixed up in this kind of thing," he said, almost conversationally. "But don't worry, the courts love a good sob story. Maybe they'll go easy on you." Talia met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Or maybe," she said smoothly, "they'll see right through yours." Carter's jaw twitched. He muttered something under his breath before striding away. As soon as she was alone, Talia leaned back against the cold wall, exhaling slowly. She had been in tighter spots before. This wasn't about escaping. This was about exposing, and the wheels were already in motion. Somewhere beyond these walls, her team already knew of her disappearance. They would find her. They always did. In the meantime, she waited. Not as a prisoner, but as a hunter biding her time. Across the station, in the break room, Carter and Sullivan lounged with steaming mugs of coffee. Their laughter filled the space. "She thinks she's untouchable," Sullivan scoffed, shaking his head. "Did you see her face? Not even a flicker of panic." "Yeah, well," Carter muttered, sipping his coffee. "That'll change." Sullivan chuckled. "This case is a slam dunk. We've got the drugs, the arrest report, no witnesses. Nobody's coming to save her." Neither of them noticed the young officer from the fingerprint station lingering outside, his face pale. His eyes flickered toward the holding cells, unease settling deep in his gut. Something wasn't right, and he was about to find out just how wrong they were. His fingers twitched against the edge of his desk. Officer James Keller had seen plenty of arrests since joining the force, but something about this one didn't sit right. He had watched Carter and Sullivan bring in suspects before, always laughing, always so sure of themselves. But this time, something was different. The woman in the holding cell, Talia Porter, hadn't reacted like anyone he had ever booked. No panic, no protests, just cold, unwavering patience. That alone sent a shiver down his spine. He had processed enough people to know that even the toughest ones showed some sign of nerves. But her? She was waiting. For what? Keller didn't know. He stole another glance toward the break room. Carter and Sullivan were still talking, still gloating. Their confidence was almost infectious. But something gnawed at Keller, a quiet alarm ringing in the back of his mind. He had learned early on that instincts mattered in this job. Slowly, he turned back to his monitor. The file on Talia Porter was still open. Her employment history was vague, listed as a consultant, nothing unusual on the surface. Yet something about it nagged at him. His fingers hesitated over the keyboard before he clicked into a separate database, cross-referencing her information. A second later, the screen flashed red. Access restricted. Keller stiffened. That wasn't normal. If she were just another suspect, her records wouldn't be locked behind high-level security. His stomach tightened as he leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Who the hell was she? In the holding cell, Talia remained motionless. Listening. She counted the steps of the officers passing by, mapped the echoes of their voices, mentally reconstructed the layout of the station. Every second spent in here was another opportunity to gather intel. She had been in tighter spots before. The key wasn't to act. It was to wait, to let her enemies believe they had the upper hand. Her eyes flicked toward the security camera mounted outside her cell. Outdated, the kind with a slight blind spot in the upper left corner. Weak infrastructure, sloppy. She made a mental note. The sound of approaching footsteps made her glance toward the hallway. Keller. He was walking past her cell. But this time, he wasn't just passing by. He hesitated. For the first time since she had been brought in, someone other than Carter and Sullivan was looking at her with something other than arrogance. Doubt. It was subtle, but she caught it. Keller turned to leave but stopped, his hand hovering over the railing. His fingers flexed, like he wanted to say something but thought better of it. Talia held his gaze, offering no expression. Just a quiet challenge. What do you see, officer? Whatever internal battle he was fighting, Keller shook it off and walked away. His steps were faster than before. Talia exhaled slowly. The seed of doubt had been planted. It wouldn't take much to make it grow. Keller returned to his desk, his pulse hammering. He shouldn't be doing this. He should let it go, ignore the nagging feeling in his gut. But he couldn't. With one last glance toward the break room, he opened a secure terminal, bypassing the standard police database. This was risky, but he needed to know. If Talia Porter was just another suspect, there would be no harm in looking deeper. He ran her name through an external database, one that wasn't tied to the local system. The screen loaded. Then, access denied. Keller's blood went cold. A denial like that didn't come from a routine background check. That level of restriction meant one thing. She was classified. Federal. Maybe even higher. He swallowed hard. They hadn't just arrested some random suspect. They had arrested someone powerful. Keller's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee, his mind racing. If she was federal, hell, if she was anything above local jurisdiction, this whole thing was about to explode. And Carter and Sullivan had no idea. In the break room, Carter stretched his legs out, sighing contentedly. "I love nights like this," he said, taking another sip of coffee. "Simple, clean, no headaches." Sullivan chuckled. "Yeah, well, I'll be loving it even more when this case sticks. The DA will have a field day with her." Carter smirked. "Maybe, but something about her bugs me." Sullivan raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "Chilton, she's too calm," Carter muttered, rubbing his jaw. "People like her, they don't just sit there. They argue, they beg, they try to cut a deal. She hasn't done any of that." Sullivan shrugged. "Maybe she's just stupid." Carter shook his head. "No, I don't think so." Sullivan scoffed. "You're overthinking it." Carter didn't answer right away. His gut was telling him something was off. He wasn't the kind to question his own actions. He had been doing this too long for that. But something about this arrest didn't sit right. Across the station, Keller logged out of the system and stood. He knew what he had to do, but the moment he took that step, there would be no going back. One choice, one decision, and everything would change. His eyes darted toward the holding cells. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with him, but he kept his mouth shut. In this station, questioning senior officers was a dangerous game. Talia Porter's silence was a weapon, and Sullivan was beginning to realize it. He had expected resistance, pleading, maybe even outrage. Instead, she had met him with nothing but unwavering calm. It unnerved him more than he would ever admit. As he disappeared down the hallway, his smirk had lost its usual arrogance. Talia exhaled slowly, leaning back against the cold concrete wall of her cell. The cracks were showing. She had seen it in Sullivan's hesitation, the flicker of doubt in his eyes. She just needed more time. A pale sliver of dawn filtered through the narrow, high-placed window. The dim light cast a muted glow on the cold walls, signaling the start of a new day. Talia hadn't moved much during the night. Sitting upright on the metal bench, her eyes half closed, in something close to meditation. Sleep was a luxury she rarely indulged in during missions. She needed her mind sharp, constantly calculating, anticipating. Outside, the faint hum of voices drifted from the hallway. The station was coming to life. She listened carefully, noting distinct tones, footsteps, small, seemingly insignificant details that revealed a great deal about the people working there. Every sound, every movement, a piece of the puzzle. A loud buzz signaled the unlocking of the cell block door. Heavy boots echoed down the corridor. Talia didn't flinch as Officer Sullivan appeared, a clipboard in hand, his usual smirk firmly in place. "Morning, sunshine," he said, his voice dripping with mock cheerfulness. "You sleep okay, or was the cot not fancy enough for you?" Talia met his gaze without a word. Her silence was more powerful than any insult. Sullivan's smirk faltered, just for a second. Then he recovered, glancing down at the clipboard. "You've got a bail hearing this afternoon," he said, tapping the paper with his pen. "But between you and me, I wouldn't get your hopes up. Judges around here don't take too kindly to drug traffickers." Talia tilted her head slightly, her expression calm, unreadable. "Good to know," she replied softly. Sullivan frowned. That quiet confidence. It got under his skin. He cleared his throat and stepped back. "Enjoy your breakfast," he muttered, before turning on his heel and walking away. Talia watched him disappear down the hallway. He was getting nervous. The performance they had staged was beginning to crumble. All she needed was a little more time. At the front desk, Officer James Keller sat stiffly, fingers tapping against the edge of his keyboard. Young, eager, fresh out of the academy, he had been trained to trust his fellow officers, to follow orders without question. But something about this case gnawed at him. It was too convenient, too perfect. Talia Porter didn't act like the criminals he had processed before. She wasn't defensive. She wasn't afraid. Her silence wasn't submission. It was strategy. He glanced up as Sullivan strode past, laughing with Carter, his demeanor casual as ever. But Keller wasn't fooled. He had seen Sullivan hesitate earlier, had noticed the faint stiffness in his movements, as if he knew something was off, but was forcing himself to play along. That bag of drugs? It was just sitting there, waiting to be found. Keller had processed the evidence himself, and the whole thing felt scripted. His instincts told him to ignore it, to push it aside like every other routine arrest. But that was the problem. This wasn't routine. His gaze flicked toward the holding cells. Through the security monitor, he saw Talia, sitting still as stone, her eyes half closed, as if meditating. Keller's stomach twisted. Either she was the most composed suspect he had ever seen, or she knew something he didn't. Keller's instincts screamed at him. Something was off. The bag of drugs. It was too convenient. Sitting neatly in the trunk like a gift-wrapped package. It felt staged. His fingers hovered over his keyboard, hesitation tightening his chest. He knew the unwritten rules of the station. You didn't question senior officers. But the doubt gnawed at him, sinking its teeth deeper with every second. His gaze flicked to the surveillance monitors above his desk. The live feed showed the hallway outside the holding cells. Talia Porter sat motionless on the bench, her posture unnervingly calm. She hadn't moved much since she was processed, her expression unreadable, her gaze locked straight ahead. Keller bit his lip, a tiny flicker of resolve sparking inside him. While Keller wrestled with his conscience, Talia made her move. Her hands rested casually in her lap, but her sharp eyes remained fixed on the camera outside her cell. The motto was old, likely outdated, poorly maintained. A station like this didn't waste its budget on high-end surveillance. She waited, biding her time. The moment the hallway cleared, she shifted slightly. Her movements precise but subtle. Hidden in the hem of her jacket was a small, inconspicuous tracker. Standard issue for CIA operatives in the field. Pressing her hand against the fabric, she triggered the device with a barely perceptible click. The tracker sent out a silent signal. A beacon her team would receive within moments. She didn't need to speak. She didn't need to explain. They would know what to do. Across the station, in the break room, Carter and Sullivan sat back, drinking coffee, flipping through the morning paper. "He's probably in there thinking we're going to crack," Carter said, shaking his head with a chuckle. "They always think they can talk their way out of it," Sullivan added with a smirk. "Yeah, well, she's in for a rude awakening. This case is a slam dunk. We've got the drugs, the arrest report, and no witnesses. Nobody's coming to save her." Carter leaned back in his chair, a satisfied grin stretching across his face. "You know what I love about this job? The predictability. You see the same types over and over. They think they're smarter than us, but they never are." Their laughter filled the room, thick with arrogance, oblivious to the storm that was already brewing just beyond their understanding. At a nearby office, a nondescript phone buzzed softly on a desk. A hand reached out, answering it. "Signal received," the voice on the other end said. Calm, yet authoritative. A pause. "Location confirmed, deploying resources." Talia leaned back against the cold wall of her cell, her eyes briefly closing. She could almost feel the gears turning. The quiet precision of her team mobilizing in the background. Every second that passed brought her closer to the inevitable reckoning. She opened her eyes, a faint smile curving her lips. Not one of amusement, but of quiet certainty. Carter and Sullivan had no idea what was coming. The station carried on as usual. Officers filing reports, answering calls, sipping coffee, laughing about trivial matters. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. For Carter and Sullivan, today felt like a victory lap. For Talia, it was the final calm before the storm. She remained motionless in her holding cell. Poised, patient, focused. Through the bars, she could see the station in motion. The occasional passing shadow. Snippets of conversation. She stayed in the background, invisible, until the exact moment she needed to be seen. Her signal had been sent hours ago. Her team would come, but they wouldn't act immediately. Timing was everything. In the meantime, she needed to plant seeds of doubt. At the front desk, Keller's eyes darted toward the holding cell monitors. Talia hadn't moved much since her arrival, yet something about her gnawed at him. It wasn't fear. It wasn't defiance. It was patience, a quiet confidence that seemed completely misplaced for someone accused of trafficking drugs. Keller's unease deepened. Unable to shake the feeling, he pulled up her file on his computer. Her driver's license, her local address. Everything appeared standard. But there was something odd, her employment history. The system flagged her most recent job as independent consultant. No details. No affiliations. A dead end. Keller frowned, his fingers hesitating over the keyboard. His instincts screamed again. Something wasn't right, and he was about to find out just how wrong they had been. Keller's fingers hovered over the keyboard, his frown deepening. Talia Porter's license information and address were straightforward. But something was off. A glaring gap in her employment history. The system flagged her most recent job as independent consultant, with no further details. It was too vague, too clean, as if someone had intentionally scrubbed the record. He minimized the file and leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting toward the break room. Carter and Sullivan lounged inside, laughing over donuts. Their carefree attitude made Keller's stomach churn. They acted like they had already won, like this was just another easy arrest. Against his better judgment, Keller clicked on the arrest report. He scanned the narrative, reading aloud under his breath. Stopped for failure to yield at a marked intersection. Driver exhibited nervous behavior during questioning. Consent to search granted. Controlled substances found in the trunk. Something didn't add up. Keller had been trained to recognize deception. The report was clean. Too clean. The wording followed protocol to the letter, as if it had been rehearsed. His gut told him this wasn't a routine drug bust. The doubt gnawed at him, an itch just beneath his skin that wouldn't go away. He found himself pacing near the holding cells, his eyes flicking toward Talia with increasing frequency. She hadn't moved much, her posture as composed as ever. Unlike most detainees, she wasn't agitated, wasn't pleading, wasn't arguing. She was waiting. For what? Finally, he stopped just outside her bars, his pulse quickening as he forced himself to speak. "Miss Porter," he said. She lifted her gaze, dark eyes sharp, assessing. "Yeah." Keller hesitated, hand resting on his belt. I just wanted to ask. Did you really consent to the search of your car?" Talia tilted her head slightly, studying him. She could see it, the uncertainty, the cracks in his resolve. "What do you think, Officer Keller?" Her tone was calm, piercing. Keller swallowed hard. "I'm just doing my job," he muttered. But even to his own ears, the words sounded weak. "That's what they're counting on." Talia's voice was steady, unwavering. "Men like Carter and Sullivan rely on people like you to look the other way." Keller's face burned. He took a step back, stammering something unintelligible before retreating down the hall. But Talia had seen what she needed to see. The seed was planted. In the heart of Arlington, a sleek black sedan rolled to a stop outside a nondescript building. Inside, a man in a tailored suit stepped out, his movements precise, controlled. He was flanked by two agents, their expressions unreadable, their eyes sharp. "ETA on extraction?" one of the agents asked. The man checked his watch. "We proceed when she gives the signal. For now, we watch." Inside a secure operations room, live feeds from the police station flickered across multiple monitors. One screen displayed Talia in her cell, sitting perfectly still. Another showed the front desk, where Keller paced back and forth, his agitation growing. "Looks like the kid's starting to crack," one agent observed. "Good," the man replied. "We'll use it when the time comes." In the break room, Carter leaned back in his chair, sipping his third cup of coffee. He smirked as he turned to Sullivan. "You see Keller earlier?" he asked. It looked like he'd seen a ghost. Sullivan chuckled, shaking his head. "Probably overthinking things. Fresh out of the academy. They always get jumpy on their first big case." "Yeah, well." Carter's smirk faded slightly. "Let's hope he doesn't start asking too many questions." Sullivan shrugged. "Doesn't matter. The evidence is airtight and she's got no alibi. Even if he gets nosy, there's nothing he can prove." Carter nodded, but for the first time, a flicker of unease crossed his face. What if Keller's doubts were contagious? Talia felt it, the almost imperceptible shift in the air. The tension in the station was rising. She knew her team was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. Slower this time. Keller hesitated just outside her cell. His face was drawn, inflicted. "Who said?" His voice was quieter now. "They're counting on people like me." Talia met his gaze, her voice measured. "You already know the answer, Officer Keller. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Keller's grip tightened on the edge of the wall. His pulse pounded in his ears. Her gaze never wavered. "You've seen something, haven't you?" she asked. Her voice was calm, wavering. Keller swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. "I don't know what I've seen," he admitted. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't true. He had seen too much. Patterns that were impossible to ignore. Names that appeared over and over. Too many lives destroyed under Carter and Sullivan's so-called justice. Talia tilted her head, expression unreadable. Then look again. A pause. And this time, ask yourself why. Keller clenched his jaw. His mind raced. Months, years, following orders without question, trusting the system to sort out right from wrong. But now, that trust felt like an illusion. The weight of his silence, suffocating. Without another word, he turned and walked away. Hands balled into fists at his sides. Inside the operations room, the suited man watched Keller's retreat on the monitor. A faint smile curled his lips. "He's close," he said, leaning forward. One of the agents exchanged a glance. "And if he doesn't break?" The man's smile widened. "Then we turn this whole thing upside down." Keller exhaled. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He had seen enough. Ignoring the gnawing in his gut was no longer an option. A deep breath. A quiet decision. He needed answers. But he couldn't afford to draw attention to himself. If Carter and Sullivan caught wind of his doubt, he'd be next. His reputation as the rookie already made him an easy target. So, he waited. The moment Carter and Sullivan left the room, Keller slipped from his desk. His movements quick, controlled. He headed for the records archive. Rows of filing cabinets. Old computer terminals. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. The air smelled of dust and aged paper. He logged into the system, hands trembling slightly. He searched for past arrests tied to Carter and Sullivan. The names flooded the screen. The same pattern, over and over. Minor traffic violations, escalated into drug charges. Unsubstantiated claims, planted evidence. And the most damning part? Almost every single defendant was a person of color. Most had been convicted. Keller exhaled sharply, his chest tightening. His eyes darted across the screen. Dates. Officer reports. Court outcomes. How had no one caught this before? Or maybe someone had. Maybe they had tried, only to be silenced. Back in her cell, Talia remained perfectly still. Patience unshaken. Years in the field had trained her for moments like this. When waiting was its own form of battle. When the air crackled with the tension of something about to break. Through the bars, she caught a glimpse of Keller's shadow moving past. His pacing had slowed. His steps more deliberate. He was unraveling the truth. Piece by piece. Fighting against the weight of everything he had been conditioned to believe. He was close. Talia shifted slightly on the bench. Just enough to catch his attention. Keller hesitated. His hand gripped the edge of the wall like a lifeline. "Talia Porter," he said, voice low. She turned to face him fully. Expression composed. "Sharp." "Yes, Officer Keller?" He exhaled through his nose. His hesitation palpable. His gaze flickered toward the security camera at the end of the hall. Then locked back onto her. A beat of silence. "Then, you were right." His voice barely above a whisper. "Something's wrong." Talia's lips curved into the faintest smile. "And what are you going to do about it?" Keller's pulse pounded. He had expected a response to his message. But not this. An immediate, forceful intervention. His stomach tightened as his gaze darted toward Carter and Sullivan. Carter had gone rigid. His usual smirk gone. His fingers curled around the edge of the table, knuckles whitening. Sullivan, less composed, shifted uneasily. His eyes flickered between the agents and the hallway leading to the holding cells. "This isn't good," Sullivan muttered. Carter exhaled sharply, masking his nerves with an easy shrug. Relax. They don't have anything. If they did, we'd already be in cuffs. Sullivan didn't look convinced. Then why the hell are they here? Before Carter could respond, the lead agent, Special Agent Marcus Langley, strode through the station with purpose. His team flanked him. They moved with the quiet confidence of men who knew they were in control. Keller felt a cold sweat trickle down his spine as he watched them disappear toward the records room. He had done what he felt was right. But now the weight of the moment pressed down on him. Had he just put a target on his back? Inside the holding cell, Talia remained still. Her hands rested lightly on her lap. Her breathing was slow, controlled. She could hear the shift in the station's energy. Casual conversations had ceased. Hushed whispers took their place. Tensions settled in the air. The realization was sinking in. Their authority was slipping. Then, the sound of boots approaching. A lock buzzed. The heavy metal doors swung open. "Talia Porter," Langley announced, his voice calm but firm. "You're free to go." Talia rose smoothly. Unsurprised. Unroached. She met Langley's gaze, nodded, and stepped forward. Two uniformed officers stood nearby. They looked as if they wanted to protest, but didn't dare. Carter and Sullivan stormed into the hallway just as she exited her cell. Their faces pale with anger. And confusion. "What the hell is going on?" Carter barked. Langley turned to face them. His expression unreadable. "You'll find out soon enough." Sullivan's mouth opened, then snapped shut. Langley's partner handed him a file. Sullivan hesitated, then flipped it open. His face drained of color. His hands trembled as he scanned the contents. Carter stepped closer, his voice sharp. "What is this?" Langley smiled faintly. "Evidence." Talia paused just long enough to let her gaze settle on Carter. His confident facade was cracking. His jaw clenched so tightly she thought he might break a tooth. She leaned in slightly, lowered her voice, so only he could hear. "I told you." Her tone was razor-sharp. "You made a mistake." Carter flinched. Before he could respond, Langley's voice cut through the air. "Officers Carter and Sullivan," loud enough for the entire station to hear. "You are hereby placed under federal investigation for falsifying reports, planting evidence, and obstruction of justice." Silence. Heavy. Suffocating. Carter recoiled as if struck. His fists clenched at his sides. "You can't be serious." Langley raised an eyebrow. "Oh, we're very serious." Two FBI agents stepped forward. Their hands rested on their holsters. "You can come quietly or we can do this the hard way," one of them said. For a split second, Carter looked like he might fight it. His shoulders tensed. His jaw flexed. Then he saw the way his fellow officers had backed away. No one moved to intervene. He was alarmed. Sullivan was already raising his hands. "Look at Edruto. Hands behind your back," the agent instructed. "Now." Sullivan complied. His face was tight with resentment. Carter followed. A beat later. Stiff, silent. The cuffs clicked shut around their wrists. A low murmur rippled through the station. Talia met Keller's gaze across the room. He looked dazed, like he was struggling to process the reality of what had just happened. But beneath that, she saw something else. Relief. As the agents led Carter and Sullivan toward the exit, the station seemed to exhale. The air, suddenly lighter. Langley turned to Talia. "We'll handle it from here." She nodded. "I know." The station doors closed behind her with a quiet click. She inhaled the crisp night air. The weight of the last few days finally beginning to lift. The battle was over. But the war, far from won. Carter's smirk wavered. For the briefest moment, then settled back into place. He shot a glance at Sullivan. His face had turned several shades paler. Sullivan's hands twitched at his sides, but he quickly masked the movement, straightened his shoulders. "Sure," Carter said, feigning confidence as he stepped forward. "I'd love to know what this is all about." Agent Price didn't respond immediately. Instead, he tilted his head toward the hallway. "Interrogation room, now." The weight in his voice left no room for argument. Carter exhaled through his nose, exchanged a quick look with Sullivan, then followed Price and the two agents. The eyes of the station were on them now. Hushed murmurs trailed their path. At his desk, Keller sat frozen, tried to steady his breathing. He had started this, and now there was no turning back. Inside the interrogation room, harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The metal table in the center cast sharp reflections. Carter and Sullivan took their seats. Their movements were tense, but they tried to appear unfazed. Price set a thick folder down, slid it across the table. Sullivan hesitated, then flipped it open. The first page alone made his breath hitch. Photos, surveillance logs, digital timestamps. Every dirty arrest they had made over the years. The walls closed in. Carter recovered first, leaned back, arms crossed over his chest. His voice was smooth, but the confidence forced the, "So, what exactly are we looking at here?" Price folded his hands atop the table. "Tell me, officers, how many times have you planted evidence before?" Sullivan flinched. Carter stayed rigid. "It is ridiculous." Price motioned toward the folder. "Is it multiple false arrests? Falsified reports? Footage showing tampered evidence?" Sullivan swallowed hard. "This doesn't look good for you?" Price finished smoothly. "I'd agree." He nodded toward the agent seated next to him. A button clicked. A recording played. Carter's voice. "And they always think they can talk their way out of it." Sullivan's. "Nobody's coming to save her." Silence. Heavy. Suffocating. Sullivan's face drained of color. His breath quickened. Pulse visible at his temple. Carter, however, clenched his jaw. His eyes narrowed into slits. "That's entrapment," he muttered. His voice was tight. Price almost smiled. "No, Carter, that's the truth. On. And it's about to bury you." Sullivan swallowed hard. "We want lawyers." Price shrugged. "You can have all the legal counsel you want. But right now we're offering you one chance. Cooperate and maybe, just maybe, you walk away from this with a lesser sentence." Carter scoffed. "We're not saying a damn thing." Price tapped his fingers on the table. "Suit yourself." He stood, straightened his tie, turned toward the door. "We'll see how long that attitude lasts when the feds finish raiding your homes." A pause. "Because that's happening right now." Sullivan's head snapped up. "You're lying." Price glanced at his watch. "Check the news in about 15 minutes. A flicker of panic crossed Sullivan's face. "Carter?" He wasn't panicked. He was furious. "I'm not going down for this," he growled. His mask finally slipped. "We did our jobs, we cleaned up the streets." Price turned back, eyes narrowing. "You framed innocent people. You ruined lives." Carter's fists clenched. His knuckles turned white. "Melly weren't innocent." Price let the words hang between them. Let them suffocate under the weight of it. Then, without another word, he turned and left the room. Outside, Talia stood just beyond the glass panel, arms crossed. Her gaze locked with Price's as he stepped into the hallway. "They'll fold," he told her. Just a matter of time." Talia's lips twitched. Not quite a smile, just a knowing look. "They always do." Sullivan's breathing turned shallow. Fingers twitching against the cold metal table, he glanced at Carter. Eerily still. expression unreadable. But Price saw it, the flicker of uncertainty in Carter's eyes, the way his jaw tensed ever so slightly. "You're bluffing," Carter muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Price chuckled, tapping his fingers on the table. "You sure about that?" He motioned to the agent beside him. A folder slid across the table. "Go ahead, take a look." Sullivan hesitated, then reached for it. The second he flipped it open, his face drained of color. Insight, signed affidavits, statements from people they had framed, victims of their manufactured arrests. The evidence was overwhelming. Carter clenched his fists. "This doesn't prove anything." Price exhaled slowly. Carter, you still think you're in control here?" He leaned in, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "We raided your lockers, your homes. You found the cash, the falsified reports, even those conveniently lost body cam footages you thought no one would recover." Sullivan swallowed hard. "This isn't—" Price didn't let him finish. He motioned to another agent. A thick sealed envelope was pulled from a bag. Then another, and another. "Guess what these are?" Price asked. Carter's fingers twitched. "Indictments. Federal charges. Wire fraud. Conspiracy. Abuse of power. While falsifying evidence." Price leaned back, expression unreadable. "You two are finished." Silence pressed down on the room. Happy, unrelenting. Carter exhaled through his nose, mind racing. They were backed into a corner, but he wasn't going down quietly. Sullivan, though, he was cracking. His leg bounced under the table, hands trembling, sweat glistening on his face. Price's gaze flicked to him. "You don't have to go down with him, Sullivan. There's a way out for you." Carter snapped his head toward his partner. "Don't say a word." Sullivan's lips parted, but no words came out. Price saw it. The hesitation, the panic. "We've got you both, but I'm offering you a deal. Testify against Carter and we talk reduced sentencing." Carter slammed his palms onto the table. "Are you seriously considering this?" Sullivan didn't answer. The seconds stretched unbearably. His shoulders sagged. The fight drained out of him. "What happens if I cooperate?" he asked quietly. Carter's glare could have burned a hole through steel. "Don't you dare." Price smiled. "Now we're getting somewhere." He gestured to the agents behind him. "Get him processed. I want his full statement in the next hour." The door opened. Sullivan stood. He couldn't even look at Carter. As the agents led him away, Carter sat motionless, jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might shatter. "You think this is over?" he growled. Price tilted his head. "For you, it is." Outside the interrogation room, Talia stood just beyond the glass, arms crossed, her sharp gaze locked onto Price as he exited. He nodded. "It's done." Talia exhaled, tension finally easing from her shoulders. She turned toward the exit. The fight was over, and justice had been served. The weight of their crimes had finally caught up to them. Carter's confidence cracked. His shoulders slumped. Sullivan, face buried in his hands, trembled under the crushing force of what they had done. The truth was out, and there was no escaping it now. At his desk, Keller watched it all unfold. He had been in that interrogation room earlier, confirming details about the department's procedures. And he had seen the moment Carter and Sullivan understood. Someone from within had spoken. Their gazes had burned into him like hot coals. But Keller didn't flinch. He had done what was right. As the agents exited, Keller's hands trembled slightly. He swallowed, then stepped forward, cleared his throat. "What happens now?" Agent Price studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Now we clean house." His tone softened. "And you did the right thing." A wave of relief coursed through Keller. For the first time since putting on the badge, he felt like he was truly serving justice. Across the station, Talia stood near the entrance, arms crossed, sharp eyes tracking every movement. Carter and Sullivan, now in handcuffs. The once untouchable officers looked like ghosts of their former selves. Pale, shoulders hunched, arrogance stripped away. Murmurs rippled through the station, some in shock, others exchanging knowing glances. Agent Price approached Talia, face unreadable. "We got everything we need," he said. "Your work here is done." Talia held his gaze, then gave a small nod. "Good. Make sure it sticks." A faint smile played on Price's lips. Well, as she stepped outside, the crisp air filled her lungs. The weight of the mission, the deception, the risk, the waiting, it all lifted, leaving behind only the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. The fallout was immediate. Within hours, the arrests of Carter and Sullivan dominated the news. Every major outlet ran the story. Police corruption exposed. FBI takes down dirty cops in Lincolnton. Their mugshots were everywhere. Screens flashed with footage of them in cuffs. A stark contrast to the power they once wielded so freely. The cases tied to their misconduct were reopened. The charges against Talia dropped. The Arlington Police Department faced a reckoning. Internal investigations swept through the ranks. One by one, corrupt officers resigned under mounting scrutiny. Keller, now a whistleblower, felt the weight of his decision. Some colleagues avoided him, their loyalty to the old system unshaken. Others, however, a quiet nod, a subtle hand on the shoulder. Respect, unspoken but understood. Regardless of where they stood, Keller walked with his head high. He had made his choice, and he didn't regret it. Weeks later, a crisp autumn afternoon, Talia sat on a park bench, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. Golden leaves rustled around her. The world moved forward, unchanged, yet entirely different. Agent Price approached, settled beside her without a word. After a moment, he spoke. "You could have handled this differently." Talia smirked, took a slow sip, and missed the look on their faces. "No thanks." Price chuckled softly. "You've got a knack for making things memorable." They sat in silence, the weight of their work momentarily forgotten. For now the storm had passed, but its impact would ripple through the system, ensuring that justice prevailed, at least for a little while. The media frenzy continued. The public outcry grew louder, but one name remained absent from the headlines. Talia Porter. Her team had made sure of that. The focus needed to stay on the corruption, not on the person who brought it down. She had never been in this for recognition, not for fame. She was interested in results. Inside a cold, windowless interrogation room at a federal detention center, Carter and Sullivan sat across from their lawyers. The arrogance that once fueled them, gone, replaced by a grim, suffocating realization. There was no way out. The charges against them? Overwhelming. Falsifying reports, planting evidence, abusing their authority. Over and over. Sullivan's hands trembled as he flipped through the file. Images, name steps, logs, undeniable. He swallowed hard. "What do we do?" Carter remained silent, knuckles whitening against the steel table. Then a muttered response. "We're not going down for this." But even he didn't sound sure. Their lawyers exchanged uneasy glances. The mountain of evidence was insurmountable. Public outrage tilted the scales against them. The media had turned them into the faces of systemic corruption. A trial? would only make things worse. A plea deal, the only way to avoid decades behind bars, if the prosecution even allowed it. Meanwhile, at the Arlington Police Department, the fallout was far from over. Internal investigations revealed the truth. Carter and Sullivan weren't anomalies. They were part of a pattern. More names surfaced. More cases unraveled. One by one, officers resigned or faced disciplinary action. The police chief held a press conference. "We are committed to transparency and reform." But the damage was done. The public no longer trusted them. A reputation they had built collapsed overnight. At the center of it all, Keller. His role in exposing corruption made him both a hero and a traitor. Some officers avoided him, loyal to the old system. Others, however, a quiet word of support, a subtle nod in passing. But Keller didn't care. He had done what was right. That was enough. A week after her release, Talia met Keller at a small diner on the outskirts of town. A quiet atmosphere, a stark contrast to the storm they had weathered. Keller sat across from her, fidgeting with his coffee cup. "Did it even matter?" he muttered, stirring his untouched coffee. "They're gone, but the system's still broken." Talia studied him. He stopped looking away. "This matters," Keller exhaled. A hint of tension eased from his shoulders. "What now?" Talia set down her cup, a smirk playing at her lips. He moved on to the next one. For the first time, Keller allowed himself a small, weary smile. "What about you? What happens now?" Talia leaned back, eyes unreadable. "No." A pause. "I move on to the next mission. There's always another fight." Weeks later, a courtroom. Carter and Sullivan sat, shoulders hunched, the weight of their fate crushing them. Gone was the arrogance, the sneers, the bravado. When the judge pronounced their sentences, the gavel struck. Final. Justice had caught up to them at last. In a quiet moment, far from the chaos, Talia sat in her sparsely furnished apartment, packing a small bag. A dossier lay open on the table, her next assignment. She skimmed through it briefly before closing it. Her mind was already focused on the road ahead. Her phone buzzed. She picked it up. "Ready for the next one?" Agent Price's voice came through the line. Talia smiled faintly. "Always." She stepped out into the crisp evening air. The door clicked shut behind her. The fight wasn't over. Not for her, not for the people she worked to protect. But for now, she allowed herself a rare moment of quiet satisfaction. Justice had been served. The truth had prevailed. And for her, that was enough. The lies were exposed. And those who thought they could manipulate the system now faced the consequences. The officers who once believed they were untouchable were now prisoners of the very system they had controlled. Meanwhile, the woman they tried to frame walked away victorious, stronger than ever. This story is a reminder, no matter how deep corruption runs, the truth will always find its way to the surface. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more gripping tales like this, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support means the world and helps bring these stories to life. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.